Ellie Grant fights to save her father's crumbling Desert Star Motel, a fading relic in rural New Mexico. With a failing roof and looming fire code violations, she's out of options. Until a storm brings a mysterious stranger, a weary Marine veteran with no name. Offering shelter, Ellie unknowingly sparks a connection. He silently repairs the motel, revealing his past as Colonel Ray Dalton. Just as Ellie faces closure, a convoy of military jeeps arrives, led by Ray, with veterans ready to rebuild. What happens next transforms the motel into a beacon of hope, hinting at a legacy reborn. Inspired by Ellie and Ray's story? Share your own moments of kindness that changed lives in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share to honor quiet heroes. Support our channel to keep these stories alive, because one open door can remind us we're never alone. Thank you for listening. The Desert Star Motel stood like a defiant relic against the unforgiving New Mexico sun. Its turquoise trim faded to a ghostly hue, peeling away in strips that fluttered in the dry wind. Its neon sign, missing its S since a brutal dust storm in 2012, flickered weakly, a half-hearted beacon on a stretch of State Route 41 that the world had long forgotten. Rust gnawed at the gutters, and the building itself seemed to serenade on, as if it were tired of standing but too stubborn to fall. To the passing eye, it was a forgotten outpost, a comma misplaced in the sprawling, dusty narrative of rural New Mexico. But to Eleanor Ellie Grant, it was everything. A fragile tether to her father's memory, a monument to his life's work, and a battle she fought daily to keep alive. At 58, Ellie carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning the language of survival. Her dark hair, now threaded with silver, was always pulled back into a tight braid, practical and unyielding, much like the woman herself. Her denim jacket, softened by years of wear, hung loose on her frame, and her hands, roughened by endless repairs, moved with a purpose that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. She knew every creak in the motel's floorboards, every quirk of its temperamental plumbing, and the exact spot to strike the office heater with her crowbar to coax it into life. Running the Desert Star wasn't a dream she'd chosen. It wasn't even a fallback plan. It was simply what remained after her father, Master Sergeant Charles Grant, passed away 3 years ago in the back room he'd once rebuilt for veterans. A Korean War Marine, Charles had run the motel with the precision of a drill sergeant, linens folded with military crispness, floors scrubbed until they gleamed like desert glass, the flag raised at dawn each day, even when his knees buckled under the weight of age. Ellie, barely 6, would watch him from the porch, her small hands clutching the railing as he saluted the flag in full uniform. His face etched with a quiet pride she didn't yet understand. He rarely spoke of the war, but his actions shouted louder than words. Every veteran who passed through got a warm bed, a hot meal, and a rate so low it barely covered costs. That room, with its faded wallpaper and sagging bed frame, was his unspoken tribute to those who'd served beside him. When Charles died, the Desert Star seemed to lose its pulse. The walls felt emptier, the air heavier, as if the motel itself mourned the man who'd given it purpose. Ellie stayed, not out of ambition, but because abandoning it felt like abandoning him. The motel was his legacy, built on honor and grit, and she couldn't walk away, no matter how many leaks sprang in the roof or how many bills piled up unpaid. But keeping it alive was a war she hadn't been trained for, and every day felt like a skirmish against an enemy she couldn't outmaneuver. 2 weeks ago, the fire marshal had arrived, his clipboard brimming with violations that felt like a guillotine. Smoke detectors so old they belonged in a museum, a breaker box corroded beyond repair, wiring in half the rooms that was one frayed connection away from a blaze. She had 10 days to fix it. 5 had already slipped by, each one tightening the knot in her chest. The bank had rejected her loan request twice, their polite letters barely concealing their disdain for a motel that served truckers, veterans, and wanderers who'd lost their way. The town offered no lifeline either, their budgets tied up in shiny new ventures, craft breweries and glamping sites designed to lure tourists who never materialized. The Desert Star, with its chipped paint and half-lit vacancy sign, was a relic they'd rather forget. Yet every morning, Ellie swept the porch, brewed a pot of bitter coffee, and flipped on the sign, its flickering letters a quiet act of defiance. Deep down, beneath the weight of defeat, she clung to a stubborn belief that the motel had one last story to tell, one last spark to prove it wasn't finished. The night the stranger arrived, the desert unleashed a storm that felt alive, as if it had a vendetta against the world. The wind screamed across the gravel lot, tearing at anything not bolted down, and the rain came in sharp, icy sheets, turning the dust into a thick, clinging mud. Lightning split the sky, its jagged veins illuminating the motel in stark flashes. Ellie was locking the office door, her fingers numb from the cold, when the bell above the frame rang out, sharp and insistent. The door flew open, and in stumbled a man who looked like he'd been forged by the storm itself. His jacket, soaked through, clung to his lean frame, water dripping from the brim of his cap to pool on the worn linoleum. Mud caked his boots, leaving smears across the floor. But it was his silence that struck her most, a heavy, deliberate quiet, as if words were a luxury he couldn't afford. His eyes, shadowed and hollow, carried a weight that seemed to pull the room inward, like a man who'd been carrying burdens so long they'd become part of him. Ellie's first instinct was caution, her hand inching toward the crowbar, but something in his stillness stopped her. Maybe it was the slump of his shoulders, the way he stood as if the world had pressed down on him for too long, or the faint tremor in his hands as he gripped the soaked edges of his coat. She didn't ask for a name or an ID. She didn't need to. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Give a man a bed, Ellie. Sometimes that's all he's got left. She handed him the key to room 8, draped a worn blanket over his shoulders, and watched him shuffle down the hall, his footsteps heavy with unspoken stories. A week later, Ellie stood in the office, packing the last fragments of her life into a cardboard box. A faded photo of her father in his Marine uniform, his jaw set and eyes bright with purpose. A chipped coffee mug he'd used every morning. A ledger filled with his neat, meticulous handwriting, a record of every guest who'd passed through. Her hands trembled as she folded the photo's edges, a lump rising in her throat. The Desert Star was slipping away, and with it, the last piece of her father she could touch. The weight of failure settled over her, a quiet ache that whispered she'd let him down, that she hadn't been strong enough to carry his legacy. Outside, the horizon rumbled, a low growl that wasn't thunder. Dust churned in the distance, and through it came the jeeps. Military one after another, their engines cutting through the stillness like a promise. What happened next wasn't just the salvation of a crumbling motel. It was the resurrection of everything her father had built, a spark that lit up the Desert Star and reminded Ellie why she'd fought so hard to hold on. The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the earth with a weight that seemed to mirror the burden on the man's shoulders. His faded jacket, soaked through, clung to his frame, the hood casting a shadow over his face as water dripped from its edge, pooling at his boots. The puddle grew steadily, a small testament to the storm's unyielding grip. In one hand, he gripped a threadbare backpack, its straps frayed and sagging, as though it had carried more than just belongings, perhaps the remnants of a life left behind. His other hand hung rigid at his side, fingers curled inward, stiff and unyielding, like a limb that had long forgotten how to relax. The world seemed to press down on him, the storm a mere echo of the heaviness he carried within. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly, as if it had been buried under years of silence. The words came haltingly, like they'd been dredged up from some deep, unused place. Just needed to get out of that storm. He didn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the rain-slicked pavement, as though searching for something, or nothing at all. Ellie stood behind the motel's front desk, her arms crossed, studying him with a quiet intensity. She took in the way he favored his left leg, the subtle limp that spoke of old injuries never fully healed. His hand pressed lightly against his ribs, a protective gesture that hinted at pain he wouldn't acknowledge. His eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, held a quiet depth, gray, guarded, and weary, like a man who'd seen too much and expected too little. She softened her tone, almost instinctively. "No ID?" she asked, not accusing, but probing gently. He shook his head, a small, resigned motion. "Wallet's gone. Bus station said the last ride out was canceled." His eyes flicked briefly to the rain pounding outside the glass door. Didn't have anywhere else to go. The words hung in the air, plain and unadorned, carrying neither desperation nor expectation. It would have been simple to turn him away. Safer, even. The world had taught Ellie to be cautious, to guard the little she had left. Her father's motel, her solitude, her fragile sense of stability. But something in the man's posture stopped her. He didn't beg, didn't lean on charm or excuses. He stood there, shoulders bowed but unyielding, carrying a quiet dignity wrapped in worn denim and fatigue. It stirred a memory of her father, the way he'd stood in this same lobby years ago, his silence heavy with unspoken battles, his pride etched into the lines of his face. That memory tugged at her, softening the edges of her caution. She gestured toward the small electric heater humming near the desk, its faint glow a meager defense against the damp chill. "Warm up," she said, her voice steady but kind. "Then I'll get you a key." He hesitated as if kindness were a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Then with a slight nod, he moved toward the heater, his limp more pronounced now that he was in motion. As he stretched his hands toward the warmth, Ellie's eyes caught a faint mark on his wrist, a tattoo nearly erased by time, but unmistakable. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the U.S. Marine Corps faded to a ghostly outline, yet still enduring. "You serve?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the question might shatter the fragile quiet between them. He nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the heater's glow. "Long time ago," he said, the words clipped but not dismissive. There was a weight to them, a story he wasn't ready to tell. "Me too," Ellie said, surprising herself with the admission. "Sort of. My dad was in Korea, then ran this place for 30 years. The words felt like an offering, a bridge across the silence. For the first time, he glanced at her, his gray eyes sharp despite their weariness, holding a flicker of curiosity beneath the caution. "You keep it going," he said. Not a question, but an observation, as if he saw the effort etched into the motel's peeling paint and creaking floors. Ellie gave a half shrug, a gesture that hid the pride and exhaustion of carrying her father's legacy alone. "Room 6 still has heat if you want it," she said, steering the conversation back to practicalities. "I don't have," he started, but she cut him off, her voice firm but gentle. "It's not about that. Just take the key." A pause stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Then slowly he nodded. Accepting the key, she slid across the counter. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer one. There was an understanding in that silence, a mutual respect for boundaries left unvoiced. 20 minutes later, Ellie found herself standing outside room 6, a folded blanket tucked under one arm, and a chipped ceramic mug of hot tea warming her hands. She knocked lightly, half expecting no answer. When the door creaked open, the man stood there, his damp jacket now draped over the room's vent, steaming faintly in the heat. His boots were neatly aligned on a towel by the wall, a small act of order in the midst of chaos. The room carried the scent of damp wool and quiet, a stillness that felt almost sacred. "I figured you might need these," she said, holding out the blanket and tea. He took them with a hesitation that spoke of unfamiliarity with kindness, his fingers brushing the mug's handle as if testing its reality. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with something like gratitude, or perhaps disbelief. "I know," Ellie replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He stared at the steam curling from the tea for a long moment, as if it held answers to questions he hadn't dared ask. Ellie broke the silence with a light chuckle. "You always take in strays?" "Only the quiet ones," she said, her tone warm but teasing. For the first time, he smiled, a small, fleeting thing, gone as quickly as it appeared, but real enough to shift the air between them. They moved to the motel's covered porch, settling into a pair of weathered chairs that creaked under their weight. The rain drummed steadily on the awning, a rhythmic backdrop to their silence. He didn't speak of his past, and Ellie didn't pry. There was no need for questions, no demand for explanations, just the warmth of the tea, the shelter of the porch, and a quiet that spoke louder than words. He didn't ask for pity, and Ellie offered none. Only the simple gift of refuge in a moment of peace. In that shared stillness, they found a fragile connection. Two souls shaped by different battles but bound by the same unspoken understanding. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a sky bruised with lingering clouds. The motel bore its wounds openly. Water had seeped beneath the awnings, pooling in corners and staining the walls. A downspout on room 3 had torn free, sending a cascade of rainwater onto the threshold, turning the gravel into a muddy mess. Ellie stepped outside with her second cup of coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her as she surveyed the damage. She sighed, already calculating which rooms would be too damp to rent, how many days it would take to dry out the carpets, and whether she could afford the repairs. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence, a quiet shift in the air behind her. The man from room 6, still nameless, stepped up beside her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Without a word, he grabbed the other end of the soaked mattress she was dragging toward the dumpster. They moved in unison, no need for coordination or conversation, hauling the heavy, waterlogged thing across the lot. It landed with a dull thump beside the trash bins, and he turned to walk away, his silence as steady as ever. 10 minutes later, Ellie glanced toward the supply shed, expecting to find it locked as always. Instead, the door stood ajar, a faint light spilling from within. She approached cautiously, peering inside. The man was there, sorting through a box of her father's old tools, rusted wire cutters, a dented hammer, a few lengths of pipe that hadn't been touched since her father's hands had last held them. He moved with a quiet purpose, as if he'd already decided what needed fixing and how to do it. That afternoon, without asking for permission or direction, he set to work. Using scraps of tin and old brackets, he patched the broken gutter, his hands steady despite the chill in the air. Ellie watched from the porch, her coffee long gone cold, a mix of gratitude and curiosity swelling in her. He worked with the same quiet dignity he carried in everything else. A man who didn't seek recognition, but couldn't leave a broken thing broken. The repaired gutter wasn't perfect, but it held firm, channeling the remaining rainwater away from the wall, a small victory in a world full of wear and tear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the weathered motel, he knelt beside a clogged drainpipe, his hands moving with a quiet precision that seemed to defy the chaos of the world around him. The pipe, choked with years of neglect, surrendered to his steady effort. He didn't rush, didn't curse the mess or the fading light. His focus was singular, as if clearing the pipe was a small act of defiance against entropy itself. Later, he climbed an ancient stepladder, its rungs creaking under his weight, the wood splintered and worn from decades of use, to patch 2 gaping holes in the roof above room 3. With nothing but roofing tar and a keen intuition honed by years of fixing what others left broken, he worked until the job was done. The ladder swayed slightly, a relic that should have been retired long ago, but he trusted it, just as he trusted his own hands. There was no flourish, no pride in his movements, only the steady rhythm of someone who understood that some things needed doing, no matter how small they seemed. The next morning, Ellie found him crouched beneath the lobby desk, his fingers deftly rewiring an outlet that had sparked unpredictably for months, only behaving when jiggled just so. He hadn't asked for permission, hadn't announced his intentions. It was as if the motel itself whispered its ailments to him, and he answered with action, like a reflex ingrained deep in his bones. Ellie stood back, her coffee mug warm against her palms, her boots resting lightly on the bottom step of the porch. She watched as he moved from task to task, reattaching loose siding that flapped in the desert wind, checking breakers that had tripped one too many times, adjusting smoke detectors with a care that bordered on reverence. Her mind wandered to the contractors she'd known, men who charged exorbitant fees for half-hearted work, their voices loud with complaints or self-important chatter. This man was different. He worked with a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if silence was his way of honoring the world around him. Ellie sipped her coffee, the steam curling in the cool morning air, and found herself wondering about him. He moved with the quiet authority of someone who had once commanded others, perhaps in a life far removed from this crumbling motel. Now, though, he seemed driven not by ambition, but by a need to be useful, to leave something better than he'd found it. Her thoughts lingered on him, but it was a moment on the 3rd day, just as the sun began to sink, that etched itself into her memory. Ellie was in the back storage room, rummaging through a cardboard box labeled Dad, Keep, in her father's familiar, slanted handwriting. The box was a chaotic archive of her father's life, Tangled metal scraps, yellowed bills, notebooks filled with sketches of minor repairs he'd never gotten around to. Each item carried the weight of his presence, his unfulfilled plans to keep the motel alive. Beneath a folded Marine Corps blanket, its edges frayed but still heavy with history, she found it, a faded, sweat-stained Marine cap. Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric, and a wave of grief washed over her, sharp and sudden. She lifted the cap carefully, as if it might crumble under her touch, and set it on the desk beside her coffee mug. She didn't hear him enter. He paused in the doorway, his gaze locking onto the cap with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he crossed the room, his steps deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible thread. He picked up the cap with both hands, his movements gentle, reverent, as though it were a relic of something holy. For a long moment, he stood motionless, clutching it to his chest, his eyes distant, lost in a memory Ellie could only guess at. The silence between them was thick, alive with unspoken stories. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised the cap to his forehead in a quiet, perfect salute, a gesture so precise it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. He placed it back on the desk exactly as he'd found it, his hands lingering for a moment before letting go. Ellie stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. He turned to her, his eyes steady but soft, and spoke in a voice low and measured. "Whoever wore that," he said, "was someone you didn't forget." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through her. Ellie's throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper. "My father." He didn't reply, didn't need to. He gave a single, respectful nod, then turned and walked back outside to finish reattaching the lobby's heater vent. In that moment, the motel felt different. The familiar smells of old carpet and rain-soaked wood still hung in the air, and the roof still groaned under the weight of the wind, but something had shifted. Not in the building, but in Ellie. His work wasn't just about fixing broken things. It was about honoring what had been, about carrying forward a legacy of care. For the first time in a long while, the motel didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a memory made tangible, a place where her father's presence still lingered in every patched wall and tightened screw. The next morning came too early, the desert light still soft and hesitant, not yet cresting the hills. The world felt suspended, caught in that quiet hour where time seemed to hold its breath. Ellie stepped outside to fetch the mail, more out of habit than necessity. She sifted through the usual clutter, bills, ads, a coupon for a car wash she'd never use. Then her fingers brushed against a white envelope, its surface stark and official, stamped with the town seal in crisp blue ink. It was heavy in her hand, not without weight, but with the kind of dread that only the bad news carried. She didn't need to open it to know what it held. She'd seen envelopes like this before. Still, her fingers tore at the paper, driven by a faint, foolish hope that the words might be different this time. They weren't. Final notice, immediate action required. You are hereby given 10 days to comply with Fire Code 203C. Failure to install updated smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in all guest rooms and to replace the primary electrical panel to meet code will result in revocation of your business license and closure of premises. She read it twice, then a third time, each word sinking deeper into her chest. No amount of duct tape on leaking pipes or extension cords snaking from the laundry room to keep room 4's lights on could change this. The city demanded permits, inspections, licensed electricians, thousands of dollars in work she didn't have the money for, couldn't borrow, and had no one to ask for help. She sank onto the front bench, the wooden slats creaking under her weight, the letter trembling in her hands. Around her, the motel slept, its doors shut, its windows dark except for room 6, where a single light glowed faintly, a small defiance against the gathering dawn. He was always awake before her, moving through the world with a quiet purpose she could never quite pin down. Ellie didn't hear him coming that morning. She never did. It was more like a shift in the air, a subtle weight that settled around her, steady and unspoken. When she glanced up from the envelope clutched in her hands, he was there, just a few steps away, wiping grease from his calloused fingers with a worn rag. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, flicked to her face, then to the letter, and he didn't say a word. She extended it toward him, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her, and he took it without breaking the silence. As he read, his jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath the stubble as he absorbed the cold, bureaucratic words. When he finished, he folded the paper with deliberate care and handed it back. "How bad?" he asked, his voice low, like he already knew the answer but needed to hear it. Ellie's throat tightened, her voice fracturing before she could speak. "It's over," she said, the words barely a whisper. "That's how bad." His brow furrowed, a deep crease forming as if he could wrestle the truth into something less final. He shifted, the rag twisting in his hands, and for a moment she thought he might argue, might offer some fix born of his stubborn resolve. "I could take another look at the panel," he said softly, almost pleading. "Maybe it's not as bad as they're saying." She shook her head, cutting him off before hope could take root. "It's not just the wiring," she said, her voice steadier now but heavy with defeat. "It's the permits, the inspector certifications, the paperwork I can't afford, the fees I can't pay. I tried the bank again. I called the county. I even begged the Veterans Business Fund. Everyone said the same thing. Sorry." Her eyes burned, tears welling but refusing to fall. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I kept this place because it was my father's. It's the last piece of him I have. His dream, his fight. But maybe holding on isn't enough anymore." He didn't respond, just stood there, the rag limp in his hands, staring at the cracked railing of the porch like it might offer some hidden wisdom. His silence wasn't cold, but it carried a weight, a shared grief he didn't know how to voice. Then without a word, he turned and walked back to room 6. The door clicked shut behind him, soft but final, like the closing of a chapter. When morning came, he was gone. No rattle of his toolbox on the gravel, no steady rhythm of his boots passing her window. Room 6 stood open, stripped bare of any sign he'd ever been there. Ellie stepped inside, her heart heavy with a loss she couldn't name. The bed was neatly made, the trash emptied, the heater humming quietly, its cover resecured with meticulous care. On the small desk lay the room key, glinting in the dim light, and beside it, a single sheet torn from the old guest ledger. Her breath caught as she reached for it, fear and curiosity warring in her chest. His handwriting was blocky, deliberate, each letter carved with purpose. 3 lines, nothing more. "You did what others wouldn't. Now let's see what happens when we do the same." No last name, no number, no forwarding address, just those words, cryptic and heavy with promise. She read it twice, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her wallet. She didn't know what he meant, didn't know if he'd ever come back. All she knew was that the motel felt different now, not just quiet, but empty in a way that ached, yet somehow brimmed with something unspoken. The desert stretched out beyond the motel, silent and vast, its stillness a mirror to her own. Ellie moved through the skeletal remains of the Desert Star, her father's legacy, with a rhythm born of habit rather than purpose. She folded linens no one would sleep in, packed boxes no one would open. The storage room was cleared, the vending machine unplugged, its hum silenced. The front office bell, polished to a warm bronze glow, hadn't rung in days. Tomorrow, the city would come. The locks would change. The motel, her father's motel, would be condemned. She told herself she'd made peace with it, but peace didn't taste like rust in her throat or sit like a stone behind her eyes. She was sealing the last cardboard box in room 2, the tape screeching under her hand, when she heard it, a low rumble, faint at first, like thunder on a cloudless day. She paused, listening as it grew louder, joined by another, then another. Engines, not one, but many. Her heart lurched. She dropped the tape and ran to the front door, flinging it open and stepping onto the porch just as a wave of dust rolled through the gravel lot. It wasn't a storm, it was a convoy. 12 military jeeps, their olive drab paint gleaming under fresh coats, their tires pristine, roared through the entrance of the Desert Star. Their headlights pierced the morning haze, slicing through the rising dust like spotlights on a stage. One by one, they turned in precise formation, pulling into a protective semicircle around the front of the motel, their engines idling with a low, steady growl. Ellie stood frozen, her flannel sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands smudged with dust and despair, her eyes wide with disbelief. The lead Jeep's door swung open, and out stepped the man from room 6. The man standing before Ellie was no longer the reserved figure with a slight limp, his jacket heavy with rain from that stormy night 6 months ago. Now he stood tall in a crisp, full-dress uniform, his polished shoes catching the glint of the morning sun, his pressed slacks creased to perfection. Rows of medals gleamed proudly across his chest, each one a silent testament to battles fought and sacrifices endured. His posture was unyielding, a pillar of strength carved from years of discipline, yet there was a quiet humility in his eyes. The nameplate across his chest read, Dalton R. Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps, and it hit Ellie like a wave, stealing the air from her lungs. She blinked, then blinked again, her mind scrambling to reconcile the unassuming stranger she'd known as Ray with this commanding figure before her. Her heart thudded, a mix of awe and disbelief swirling in her chest as she tried to make sense of the transformation. Ray moved toward her with deliberate steps, his expression softened by something tender, almost apologetic. The weight of his gaze held her in place, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "Ray," she breathed, the single syllable trembling with emotion. He offered a faint smile, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken stories, tugging gently at the corners of his mouth. "After I left," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "I made some calls." He gestured behind him, and Ellie's eyes followed, landing on a group of men and women stepping out of dusty Jeeps parked in the cracked lot of the Desert Star Inn. Some wore uniforms, others plain clothes, but all carried tool belts, duffel bags, and a quiet determination that seemed to radiate from their very bones. "To the people I served with," Ray continued, his voice steady but laced with reverence. "The ones who still believe in honor. To organizations that help veterans rebuild. To foundations that never forget what sacrifice means." He paused, his gaze shifting to the crumbling, wooden facade of the inn behind Ellie's shoulder. The sight of it, the peeling paint, the sagging roof, the years of neglect etched into every splinter, seemed to stir something deep within him. "But this time," he said, his voice softening, "we're not rebuilding for us. We're rebuilding for you." Ellie's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind reeled, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was saying. She'd spent years pouring her heart into this rundown motel, offering shelter to weary travelers and lost souls without ever asking for anything in return. It was her way of holding on, of keeping the Desert Star Inn alive, despite its decay. And now here was Ray, standing before her with a quiet resolve, offering something she'd never dared to dream of. "You didn't ask," Ray added, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. "You just gave. That's what made it matter." Behind him, the volunteers were already moving, their actions swift and purposeful. Extension cords snaked across the lot, paint cans clinked as they were pried open, and ladders scraped against the weathered siding. A man in a navy cap knelt by the inn's ancient fuse box, studying a wiring schematic Ellie hadn't even known existed, his brow furrowed in concentration. A woman in a worn beanie moved from room to room, inspecting broken smoke detectors with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it countless times before. The air buzzed with activity, but it wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, reverent, like a symphony played in hushed tones. Ellie stood, frozen, her heart pounding as she tried to process it all. "But why?" she finally managed, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Ray's eyes didn't waver, and when he spoke, his words were gentle, like a hand reaching out to steady her. "Because sometimes," he said, "it only takes one open door to remind people what home looks like." His words landed like a spark in dry grass, igniting something deep within her. Hope, gratitude, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. The sounds of drills and soft laughter echoed across the lot, blending with the desert wind. It didn't feel like construction. It felt like redemption, like the world was being pieced back together, one careful act at a time. The work began not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet, almost sacred hush, the kind that falls when something profound is about to unfold. The veterans didn't march or salute that morning. They simply rolled up their sleeves and got to work, their movements steady and practiced. Like a unit that had fought together in far darker places. The sun broke over the desert horizon, casting golden light across the front lot of the inn, which was already transforming into something more than the sum of its parts. Gloves were pulled on with care, tools unpacked with precision, and ladders propped against walls that had long ago given up under the weight of time. There was no shouting, no barked orders, just the quiet rhythm of people who knew exactly what needed to be done. Colonel Raymond Dalton, no longer just Ray, stood at the heart of it all. He was a quiet conductor, guiding the effort without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to. The men and women around him moved with a shared purpose, their actions infused with a sense of mission that went beyond the task at hand. This wasn't just about fixing a building. It was about honoring something deeper, something Ellie had unknowingly kindled with her selfless care. The electrical crew rewired the inn's corroded fuse box in a single day, untangling a mess Ellie had feared would spark a fire for years. A team of former Navy electricians replaced faulty breakers, their hands steady as they worked through the intricate wiring. Another crew installed new carbon monoxide detectors in every room, each device tested, checked, and double-checked with meticulous care. A group of veterans from a Colorado-based nonprofit hauled in supplies, cans of fresh paint, smooth wood paneling, gleaming new fixtures. They worked in pairs, their low voices carrying the occasional joke, their laughter deep and weathered. The kind that only comes from people who've seen the worst of the world and still found a way to smile. That laughter wasn't just noise. It was a balm, healing wounds Ellie hadn't even realized were there. By midweek, Room 7, once a forgotten storage space filled with dusty linens, had been transformed into something softer, something sacred. It was now a reading room, its low bookshelves lined with donated paperbacks and journals, its soft chairs inviting weary souls to sit and breathe. A former combat medic named Harris had built the window seat himself, his hands steady as he screwed in the final leg. "A place to breathe," he said simply, his voice rough but kind, and Ellie felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined guests finding solace in that quiet corner. Out back, where a patch of desert had once been littered with rusted junk and windblown trash, the volunteers had worked a small miracle. They cleared the debris, planting low-water shrubs and 3 sturdy shade trees that promised relief from the relentless sun. A simple stone pathway wound through the space, leading to a small statue at its center. A folded flag carved in stone encircled by bricks engraved with the names of those who had been lost. Ellie's heart clenched as she read the names, each one a story, a life, a sacrifice. She thought of Ray, of the weight he carried behind his steady gaze, and of the people around her who had come together to rebuild not just her inn, but a piece of themselves. As the days passed, Ellie watched the transformation unfold, her emotions a tangled mix of gratitude, awe, and something she couldn't quite name. She thought of the nights she'd spent alone in the inn, worrying over bills and broken pipes, wondering if her small acts of kindness mattered to anyone. Now, standing in the midst of this quiet revolution, she knew they had. Ray and his team had seen her heart, her struggle, and they'd answered in a way she could never have imagined. The Desert Star Inn was no longer just a fading relic of the past. It was becoming a beacon, a place where broken things could be made whole again, where open doors reminded people of home. And as Ellie stood there watching the veterans work under the wide desert sky, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. The memorial garden stretched out before the lodge, hushed in the tender embrace of dusk, yet pulsing with a vitality that Ellie had never imagined could exist in such a place. The fading light cast a golden glow over the neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds, breathing life into what had once been a forgotten corner of the property. Just past the garden shed, once a chaotic jumble of rusted tools, broken vacuum cleaners, and discarded odds and ends, stood a modest chapel. It was little more than a single room, its wide windows inviting the desert's fleeting warmth inside, with handcrafted pews that seemed to carry the weight of quiet reverence. A local veteran from Albuquerque, now a carpenter with hands steady from years of service and craft, had carved a simple wooden cross that hung on the wall. Its presence was unassuming, yet profound. No denomination claimed it, no dogma defined it. As Rai, her brother, had explained during one of their walks past the chapel, it was simply a space for reflection, a sanctuary for remembering the past, or perhaps for letting it slip away for a while. Ellie's heart stirred at the thought, a mix of awe and disbelief at how this place, once so worn and neglected, was beginning to feel like something sacred. By the seventh day, the transformation of the lodge was almost unrecognizable. The peeling paint had been replaced with fresh, crisp siding that gleamed under the desert sun. The sagging roof had been rebuilt, sturdy and proud, no longer bowing under the weight of time. New light fixtures cast a warm, reliable glow, and the heaters hummed softly, filling the rooms with comfort. Even the old vending machine, tucked in the corner of the lobby, had been revived, its neon lights flickering to life as if it, too, had been waiting for years to serve a purpose again. Ellie wandered through the renovated spaces, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors, and felt a swell of pride tinged with something deeper, something like hope. The lodge wasn't just a building anymore. It was a testament to resilience, to the possibility of renewal. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dipped low and stretched long shadows across the gravel driveway, the entire staff gathered near the entrance. A new sign had been erected, its bold letters set into a sturdy stone base, flanked by vibrant flower beds that seemed to hum with life. Desert Light Veteran Lodge, it read, a name that carried weight and promise. Rye stood beside Ellie, his cap clutched tightly in his hands, his usually stoic face softened by a flicker of emotion. A young ROTC cadet, her posture sharp and purposeful, stepped forward, unfurling a flag with careful precision. As she raised it slowly up the pole they'd installed that morning, the red, white, and blue fabric caught the breeze, climbing into the golden sky with a grace that felt almost holy. Ellie's knees buckled beneath her, a tremor running through her body as tears welled up, unbidden and unstoppable. She wasn't crying for the fresh paint or the rewired lights or the countless hours of labor. No, her tears were for something far greater. For the first time in years, this place wasn't just a monument to her father's memory, a fading echo of his life. It felt like a future, a living, breathing promise of healing and hope. As the flag reached its peak, fluttering proudly above the roofline, Ellie noticed the way everyone around her stood a little taller, their shoulders squared, their eyes fixed on the banner. This wasn't just a building anymore. It was a vow, a commitment to those who had served, to those who carried invisible wounds, to those who needed a place to belong. The paint on the sign was still fresh when the first visitor arrived, pulling up in a beige sedan with California plates. She parked under the shade of a newly pruned mesquite tree near room 4, the branches casting dappled shadows across the car's hood. Ellie stepped outside to greet her, a towel slung over one shoulder and a clipboard tucked under her arm, expecting another weary traveler passing through the desert. But the woman who emerged was different. Tall and silver-haired, she wore a navy blue cardigan and clutched an old, carefully folded flag against her chest. Her smile was warm, radiant with a quiet strength that caught Ellie off guard. "I'm just here for the weekend," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a weight of memory. "My husband was a Navy man. We used to drive through this area on our way to Roswell. I heard about the new name, Desert Light. He would have loved that." Ellie's throat tightened, a lump forming as she nodded, her heart swelling with an unexpected sense of connection. "Welcome home," she said, the words slipping out with a sincerity that had surprised even her. She meant it deeply, and in that moment, she felt the lodge's purpose crystallize. This was a place for those who carried their pasts with them, a place to rest, to heal, to feel seen. The next day, a Gulf War medic named Travis roared in on a Harley, his service dog perched confidently in a sidecar, sporting goggles and a vest that made Ellie smile despite herself. Travis was a man of few words, his eyes carrying a quiet intensity that spoke of battles fought long ago. He booked a room for 2 nights, and on the second evening, Ellie found him in the reading room, his broad frame settled into an armchair. He was thumbing through a worn copy of The Things They Carried, his hand resting gently on his dog's head, the animal's steady presence grounding him. As Ellie passed by, he didn't look up, but his voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "I didn't know I needed this," he whispered. the words heavy with unspoken gratitude. Ellie paused, her heart catching at the vulnerability in his voice, and she carried that moment with her, a reminder of why this place mattered. Then came a young woman, barely 20 or 21, dressed in crisp ROTC greens, her posture rigid and her eyes sharp with purpose. She'd driven from Flagstaff, chasing a rumor that one of her grandfather's old platoon mates from Vietnam was staying nearby. "He thinks no one remembers," she told Ellie, her voice steady but laced with quiet urgency. "But I do." That afternoon, the young woman and the older veteran sat together in the chapel, their voices filling the small space with stories, laughter, and stretches of companionable silence. The desert wind slipped through the open windows, carrying their words into the vastness outside. Ellie watched from a distance, her chest tight with a mix of awe and humility, knowing that this moment, this connection, was exactly what the lodge was meant to foster. Later that week, Ellie checked in a man whose file was sparse, offering little beyond a name and a referral from a veterans recovery program in Texas. Traumatic brain injury, limited speech, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the world. He kept to himself, moving quietly through the lodge, his presence almost ghostly. But on his third morning, as Ellie passed through the courtyard, she saw him pause under the shade canopy, where a Marine veteran was strumming an old guitar, the notes soft and unhurried. Then, something extraordinary happened. A smile, small and fleeting, but undeniably real, flickered across the man's face. Ellie stopped in her tracks, her breath catching as she turned away to hide the sudden sting in her eyes. That smile, so fragile yet so powerful, was a glimpse of something stirring to life, a spark of connection in a place built for just that. Under the vast New Mexico sky, where stars burned bright against the endless dark, Ellie sat with her father's old journal cradled in her lap. Its pages, worn and yellowed, carried his jagged handwriting, half filled with notes about radiator repairs, scribbled diagrams of motel plumbing, and sketches of dreams he never spoke aloud. She traced the edges of the book, her fingers lingering on the leather cover, as if touching it could pull him back from the years that had stolen him. That night, her heart felt heavy, not with sorrow, but with a quiet resolve, a flicker of something new. Healing, she'd come to learn, didn't always storm in with purpose or announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it slipped in silently, uninvited, settling into the cracks of a life without asking for permission. It wasn't just a place to rest, it was a space to remember, to gather the scattered pieces of a self left behind, and to start again. She closed the journal with care, as if sealing a promise, and stepped outside the motel. The desert air was cool, the horizon swallowing the last threads of daylight behind the freshly painted sign that read, Desert Light Veteran Lodge. It wasn't a grand gesture, that sign, but it was hers, a beacon for those who came not in waves or with banners, but with heavy hearts and fragile hopes. They arrived carrying memories of battles fought, of comrades lost, of lives they weren't sure how to reclaim. Ellie watched them come one by one, their footsteps soft but deliberate, as if drawn by something they couldn't name. She didn't just see their faces, she felt their stories, each one a thread weaving into the fabric of this place she'd never meant to build. Ellie had never pictured herself leaving the dusty roads of New Mexico, much less standing under the glaring lights of a Washington, D.C. hotel ballroom. Yet there she was, at the National Veteran Reintegration Summit, her modest navy dress clinging to her frame, the weight of her father's locket resting against her chest. It was the same locket he'd pressed into her palm years ago, along with the motel keys, his eyes bright with a pride she hadn't understood then. Now, facing a room of generals, veteran program directors, and senators in their polished shoes, she felt a tremor in her hands but not in her voice. "I didn't plan this," she said, her words steady, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "I didn't build a retreat or launch a movement. I just opened a door." They walked through it themselves. The audience didn't erupt into applause. They sat still, their silence louder than any ovation, their eyes locked on her. It wasn't about budgets or policies or numbers on a page. It was about people, about the quiet dignity of being seen, of being given a space to exist without judgment. Ellie's words carried the weight of every veteran who'd crossed her threshold, every story she'd held in her heart. She spoke of the motel, of the desert's vastness, of the way hope could grow in the most unlikely places. And they listened, not just with their ears, but with their souls. 2 weeks later, Ellie was back where she belonged, on the worn steps of the Desert Light Veteran Lodge. The desert stretched before her, its silence a comfort, its stars a reminder of how small she was and how vast the world could be. Beside her sat Ray, no longer in his crisp colonel's uniform, but in a soft flannel shirt and boots scuffed by years of walking paths no one else could see. His presence was steady, grounding, like the desert itself. They didn't speak for a long time, the quiet between them as natural as breathing. Ray's eyes, once shadowed by years of war and loss, now held a softness, a peace hard won. He leaned closer, his voice low, almost lost in the night. "Peace isn't something you chase out there," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "It's something someone has to show you in here." Ellie didn't respond, not with words. She let a small smile curve her lips, closed her eyes, and let the night wrap around her like a blanket. The desert was alive with its own rhythm, the hum of crickets, the whisper of wind, the pulse of a world that didn't rush. In a life that often felt like it was speeding past, Ellie had created something timeless, a place where the forgotten could be remembered, where kindness wasn't just a gesture, but a lifeline. She thought of her father, of the journal, of the veterans who'd found their way to her door. She hadn't set out to change the world, but maybe, in her own small way, she had. The Desert Light Veteran Lodge might have been born from her hands, but its spirit belonged to everyone who crossed its threshold. Across the country, there were others like Ellie, quiet keepers of places and promises, holding space for those the world overlooked. And there were men and women like Ray, veterans whose service never ended, whose courage lived in the way they carried their scars. Ellie's door, opened on a whim during a storm, had become a gateway to something greater, a reminder that a single act of compassion could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. In the stillness of that desert night, Ellie felt it all, the weight of her father's legacy, the hope of those who'd found refuge, and the quiet strength of her own heart. She didn't need to speak to know Ray felt it too. They sat together, two souls bound by a shared understanding, watching the stars and letting the world turn without them for just a moment. And in that moment, they were enough.